everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak here at Strategy in Future, and my guest today is Nicholas Myers, who joined Strategy in Future recently, actually this month. And we have worked with Nicholas for many years, a great strategist, thinker about Eurasia, and especially about Russia. Hi, Nicholas.
Good morning, Jacek. How are you doing?
Yeah, we're having early September in Warsaw, here in the middle of the distance between Washington, D.C. and Beijing. It's actually 200 kilometers closer to Beijing. And today we're, just exploring this possibility that I'm having Nicholas Myers with me and the discussion. Just let's talk about the Baltic states and the defensibility, their strategic role, their strategic position, and basically about Central Eastern Europe, if I may put it that way.
Right. So, a short way of background, I actually did spend a considerable amount of time living in Estonia, in Tartu. So I don't claim to know all of the three countries that we're going to be talking about most today equally. In fact, I learned about them at very different times, but I have spent a decent amount of time up there. It is a lovely place, and I recommend anybody who wants to go visit to go see as much of them as you can, and especially get out of the three capitals if you can. I would like to start by emphasizing a simple point. I don't like the term the Baltic states for these three countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This is a term that the Russians made up for them in order to understand the pre-Baltic region. And as a result, it's not how they think of themselves. In fact, the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians have extremely different histories and cultures. So Lithuania obviously is a medieval country that became part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And at one point, the Lithuanians controlled Kiev. So not a very long-lasting, but a powerful empire, at least at one point. And as a result, they have a pretty distinct identity politically. The Latvians, by contrast, are also Baltic peoples, like the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians and the Latvians are the only Baltic peoples, true Baltic peoples in Europe, with the two oldest Indo-European languages still spoken today, which is why Lithuanian is incredibly difficult to learn. But the Latvians are basically a 19th century conception of all of the tribes of the Balts that are not Lithuanians combined together. Now, some of these tribes are very, very small. Like the Livonians you'll see on old maps, but I think there's only about 90-odd true Livonians left in the world. So they've been converging, and now they would think of themselves as one nation today, in the same way that the Germans may not have thought of themselves coherently as one nation several hundred years ago, but now they do with more of a regional as opposed to a pan-national conception. I still hear from time to time that some Latvians cannot understand their partner's parents if they come from a particular dialect, and particularly Latgalians in the east tend to have a very, very distinct dialect from the rest of Latvia. And then the Estonians are not Balts at all. They are part of the Finno-Ugric people, so very closely related to the Finns on the other side of the Gulf of Finland. And they and the Finns, and I believe it's the Mordvins, I might be confusing which one of the Volga peoples they are, actually predate the Slavs and the Balts in the entire Northern European area. And it was only after the Mongols came through that the Slavs actually started moving in large numbers into what they now refer to as Velikiy Rus, Great Russia. And since then, obviously, the demographics have completely shifted. But as a result, like these three countries are very, very different. So you want to talk about the Baltic states, there's 9 of them, as you can see on this map here, which I'll explain in a minute. So when I hear the term Baltic states, I try to think of all 9 since they all have some relation to what the security situation is around the sea. But what is true is that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have been very much in the same geopolitical bucket in the 20th century. And perhaps that will change. To a certain extent, their status now is reminiscent of more medieval times when the Catholics took control of the area that is now theirs, whereas the Orthodox held them off at the Battle on the Ice in the Lake Peipus, which is right on the Estonian-Russian border. Another great place to go visit. Wonder how they found each other on the ice because it's a very, very big lake. But I think it's more important to look at them in the perspective of just being a part of the broader Baltic area. Now, one of the things I love most about strategy is that it really is a convergence of all the sciences that you can imagine, from history to weather science to military science and everything else. They're trying to make sense of many, many different competing influences. So I wanted to start with this map of the Vaikselian Glacier about 12,000 years ago for a very simple reason that most people do not think about when they're thinking about the Baltic states, or about Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And that is that the geographical features of this region are actually fairly different from that further south. So when you're in the United States and you look at a map of NATO and you see that it extends up this small corridor from Poland into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, you would think, this is the end of that needs to be defended. And it's true, but it's not how the terrain lays itself out. So at the end of this glacier, about 12,000 years ago, it didn't obviously disappear overnight. It started to retreat. And if you look at either northern Poland or Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, or Finland for that matter on Google Earth, or you fly over them, this goes also for Kaliningrad Oblast of Russia, you'll see that there are a lot of small lakes. These are preponderantly leftover ancient lakes from this retreating glacier. And it means that the terrain south of where the Wisła switches to the west in Poland is dramatically different from that to the north. So you see on this map that obviously the glacier did not quite get all the way to that switch and to the turn of the Wisła. That has a lot to do with the rocks the glacier pushed in front of it. And you can still see some pretty dramatic geological changes in this region.
And I can confirm with my own eyes, I have a summer house in the north of Poland, right on the lake, right where there are many stones from the glacier times and the hilly terrain with very peculiar characteristics for the warfare. So this is duly confirmed, Nick.
So when we think about World War II, the area around from Warsaw to basically Kiev is like the world's greatest tank country in the world. So when one side breaks out, like the advances are enormous. Whereas north of Poland, north of Warsaw, things are very, very different. During the Second World War and most wars beforehand. And most famously, the Russian army got very much lost between all of the different lakes that were canalizing their movements in 1914. When the Germans, both being the owners of the area and having greater logistical networks, were able to more efficiently move their forces around to counter anything the Russians were attempting. So this is going to present a strongly canalizing dynamic to any attack on the Baltic states that is going to, it complicates how most NATO officers think about these countries. Number one thing I hear from U.S., especially U.S. Army officers who come to the Baltic, who come to Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, is that in contrast to places like South Korea, where it's extremely obvious how the North Koreans would attack simply because the terrain is extremely canalized, it looks on the surface to be very open. But it appears that way only because the terrain is flat in most of the areas. There's a small section in southeast Estonia that is somewhat hilly. But in reality, not only are the trees going to make mechanized warfare very difficult off-road, but the water table is extremely high, and U.S. tanks sink in the Baltic, in the area around the Baltic, not just in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but also Poland, which of course is my understanding of why the Poles continue to buy the Leopard 2 tanks, which are much more attuned to that type of warfare. But as we start to move into the dynamics of how the specific borders of these countries function in terms of modern strategy, we need to look at what are the major controlling factors for the logistics of the different sides. As in the era since about the 1960s of missile warfare, especially at sea, it becomes extremely difficult to replicate what were the major military operations of the major innovative operations of the Baltic Sea from the First and Second World Wars. So in particular, Operation Albion that the Germans conduct to take control of the Estonian island of Saaremaa, as well as some of the other smaller ones around it in 1916 or 1917, is a very interesting operation to study for historical reasons, as it's the beginning of truly joint warfare in a maneuver mechanized sense. However, in the modern world, it's difficult to pull that sort of operation off simply because the Baltic Sea is surrounded by various countries with capabilities various capabilities for standoff warfare. So as different countries approach the key terrain that they're trying to seek, the sea becomes less of an avenue than it becomes a means that it becomes a public commons that can be shut off. Because though the sea is fairly large, for naval radars, it really is not very big at all, and there's very few places to hide in this sea. And this becomes the foundation of why NATO is having some difficulties imagining how to reinforce these countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania specifically, in the event of there being a conflict with a large country such as the Russian Federation. So why don't we start by looking at what Russia might be interested in? Jacek, can you switch to the plain pre-Baltica map? So as most people who have, probably most strategy and future viewers are already aware, the Russian logistics is dominated by rail. This is a subsection of a map from 1991, so a bit old, but if you look at openrailwaysmap.org or things of that nature, you see that it hasn't changed dramatically much. Why would Russia want to attack Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania today? There's honestly very few reasons I can think of besides either proving a point, which seems extremely dangerous and something that I don't see as especially likely, or it would probably more likely be to reinforce Kaliningrad Oblast in the event of there being some sort of destabilization going on in there. We can imagine there being major protests over corruption in the region. Within the Russian Federation itself, Kaliningrad Oblast is sort of a joke for being among the most corrupt. It's sort of the black zone of the Russian Federation where bribes are necessary to do anything. So we can imagine that there might be some disorder there sometime in the indefinite future. And under those circumstances, though, I would still imagine that the Russians would be seeking to do airlift into the region or sea lift into the region in order to provide whatever elements of force might be necessary to restore order within the exclave. However, if we assume also that there is some sort of democracy protest component to this, and that perhaps some European countries interested in human rights and so forth decide that they are going to try to blockade Kaliningrad Oblast in order to allow the protesters to make their voices heard. Again, all hypothetical, but this is the only reasonable scenario I can imagine. then the Russians may need to resort to using an overland attack against Kaliningrad. Now, in the West, we are endlessly obsessed with this so-called Suwałki Gap or Suwałki Corridor. It is the relatively short boundary between Poland and Lithuania. So on this map, you see this pink area, which is the Lithuanian territory today, whereas the orange is Kaliningrad, and then a sort of darker brownish area at the bottom is Belarus today. On a map, it looks relatively easy to close this area off because it's just not very large. But as soon as you switch to a terrain feature map, or you go there, or you fly over it on Google Earth, you'll see that it's not, in fact, a simple region to close. If only because the area coming out of Belarus into Lithuania to close this off in is extremely wooded, with almost no roads. I think there's just one service road that was the Soviet Border Patrol way, if that would be the only one capable of holding a tank, and you can close it very easily with just a couple of javelins. Perhaps you just attack helicopters nearby. Obviously, there'd be some air defense capabilities, but you don't need a very large force in order to make it almost impossible to start moving there, or at the very least, to start mounting up the casualties sufficiently that it becomes a very difficult task to hold. And then, assuming that the Russians bring some sort of overwhelming strength in order to blow out whatever insurgency is going on there, as soon as they control the full length of the corridor, the area in the west of it is relatively open, near Marijampolė, in southern Lithuania. If they try to hold that, they've now got a major area that can be easily conventionally attacked with virtually any force. So it's sort of a dual problem. As a result, I don't think the Suwałki Corridor is very important when we think about this. It's also, as the Russians well know, the place that the NATO is focusing on exclusively when they're talking about Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And Maskirovka, or the element of surprise, is almost the center point of all things that Russians learn on an operational tactical level. I remember reading, when I was first reading through Russian tactical field manuals a couple of years ago, I was surprised by just how every fourth word is Maskirovka. It's the number one obsession that they have when they're doing operational design. So why would they attack NATO in the one place that we are sending study after study to figure out how to defend? So much more likely, I think they're going to try to follow one of these rail lines that we see here. If you switch to the other map of the rail with the arrows, there are two major routes that I imagine. Again, this is, oh, not like this for the other one. Again, this is, by starting to focus on this, it becomes more likely that we'll come up with a surprise also, which I'll go through in a moment. But if the Russians are going to be dependent upon rail in order to resupply whatever ground forces they're sending into Kaliningrad, then obviously the operation is not a success until they control a rail link. And if you look at the Suwałki Corridor here, there is no rail link that goes through it, unless they want to go all the way through Białystok out into very...
Nicholas, if I may, it's just yes. for the audience to properly understand, there are always some voices in the debate that, quote, in the contemporary warfare, who cares about the railways? It's all about cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. You know, you press the button and suddenly everything appears wherever you want, and so on and so forth. If you just could sort it out, so to speak, why railways are important, what the logistics tail means, and how heavy the current force structure tends to be.
It's incredibly important to remember that in the modern era, especially since the end of the Cold War, when we have gotten rid of all sorts of large divisions, everything is supposed to be technology heavy, that in order to be somewhere, you need an extraordinarily enormous amount of equipment following you. And with mechanized warfare in particular, I don't know the specific ratios, but we should imagine that a majority. We should imagine that a large subsection of the manpower that would be going through Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in this hypothetical scenario would just be there for logistics. The Russian military exercises very, very frequently the concept that the railways are going to be bombed by B-52s or B-2s or by long-range missiles coming from anywhere, and that they need to restore it rapidly. So this is the number one thing that they call the railway troops prepares for. There's not a large concentration of railway troops in the Western Military District, at least not directly on the borders. So it's one of those things that we should be able to see them moving forward if there was a real possibility of an attack. But there's no shortage of these forces available. And I cannot imagine that they're not looking at the history of the rail networks around them and figuring out how to maintain this. Usually at the beginning of the major Russian strategic operational exercises that gets everybody so excited, there's about 3 or 4 days of them loading all of the tanks and armored fighting vehicles onto the rails and then unloading them at the designated training areas where the exercise is to take place. So at the end of ZAPAD 2017, there was small controversy that it took some time to load some of the tanks back up inside of Belarus to go back to the Russian Federation, and had about 24 hours of thinking, maybe they are staying around, as everybody was thinking about. But it's just an enormous operation, and if you read some of the old Soviet journals about logistics, there's a lot of articles about how to properly plan a rail operation. That and like river crossing operations is something that especially the Soviets, but the Russians still were extremely interested in how to make sure that it doesn't slow down their pace of advance. So in the event that there was a conflict going on, can NATO destroy these rail lines? Yes. Can the Russians rebuild them just as fast? Also, yes. In the same way that some of the Russian analysts like to brag, we can simply suppress the NATO airfields and they'll never be able to act again because NATO is so slow at repairing them. That's also not quite true. Yes, can Russia suppress airfields in Poland and even in Germany relatively early in the war? Of course they could, but I have pretty high confidence that NATO could repair those airfields and we'd be moving again. So it's not, if we imagine that you can turn infrastructure on or off, that is not true. The one domain in which I believe you could actually turn things on or off is space, which is a completely different environment. And honestly, in space, you can't turn it back on. Once you turn it off, it's going to be a mess. So if we come back to this particular map, I've drawn the solid red line as coming from the Pskov Oblast in Russia down through the eastern part of Latvia, that Galia, as I was mentioning before, and then turning westward once you got past Daugavpils, through Lithuania, and then onward into Kaliningrad. The dashed lines are alternatives that could also work, though they require they require both going through Vilnius and Kaunas, which are very, very, the biggest of the Lithuanian cities, and obviously populated areas are not where the Russians want to be fighting. Back during the late 1940s and 1950s, the Russians had to deal for a long time with insurgencies going on inside these three countries, as well as Western Ukraine, called the Forest Brothers. You'll see all sorts of propaganda being hurled both ways about how these were freedom fighters or they were all Nazis. I tend to stand with the fact that the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians were pretty badly abused by both sides even before the Second World War started in their region. And so these were people trying to defend their homes from outside occupiers well into the Soviet era. Lithuania, they hold out to the early 1950s. But as a result, the Soviets became very concerned about fighting insurgencies in the forests. But within the Soviet timeframe within the period of Soviet occupation of these three countries, the population became urbanized. And now ordinary Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians live in the cities. So it's no longer a question of forest insurgencies. It's a question of urban insurgencies. Not terribly dissimilar from what happens in the Middle East. It's not like there's people active in the middle of nowhere. It's people are causing disorder within the urban areas. So as a result, I think it's unlikely that the Russians would be trying to fight their way through all of Vilnius and Kaunas on their way into trying to save a situation in Kaliningrad. I think it's much more likely that they would follow the solid red line. Because among other things, if this in turn escalates dramatically into now this is a full-scale Russia versus NATO war, as seems likely since they are driving through NATO territory, controlling that area in the center of Lithuania near Panevičius offers considerable opportunities for encircling Riga relatively quickly, as well as moving to encircle Vilnius and Kaunas through other axes of advance coming out of Belarus.
If Nick, I may add a few comments again for the audience,
yes.
As we have recorded already a few podcasts and videos about the Baltic terrain, and your observation and your conclusions would nicely align with what we were discovering. We were on a tour terrain with one purpose. We wanted to ride it, drive around it, to see what would be the Polish military interest, okay, from the Polish perspective. And that beautifully aligns with what you're saying. We also thought, and still we are of the thinking, that the line of advance that you outlined is the main thrust. And this is a strategically important observation, as this, first of all, cuts through the Baltic states. Second, it doesn't need to fight in Vilnius and in Kovno. And Kovno, especially Kaunas, is a very difficult place to crack. Okay, surrounded by two rivers, forests, it can easily be defended. And also the Russians don't need to cross the Nemunas River Valley, okay, which is critically important because they can achieve their war objective, without the need of, crossing a very difficult terrain where the defense can be established. Plus, politically, Vilnius is intact, Kaunas is intact, and most importantly, German troops in Rukla, behind the next Neris River, south of your main axis of advance, is intact.
Yes. Throughout all of this, the Russians will be saying, why don't we de-escalate this?
Yes.
We will stay only on the rail line if you just let us go through, and we will not shoot anybody. The more the Russians start to break cities, the more there's no way either side can negotiate their way out of this.
More important, also one important observation for our audience, please take a look at this red line, and it goes from Pskov to Rezekne, which is Rzeszyca in Polish, then to Daugavpils, which is Dyneburg in Polish, across the Dvina River, the Daugavpils River, yes. And that is mostly populated by the Russian speakers, by the way. And then cut through the empty terrain in Lithuania and Poniewiesz, and right down to Tylja, Sovietsk, on the Nemunas River, where the Russians hold this bridge anyway. And between Sovietsk and Kaunas, there is only one more bridge in Jakurbas, which they might easily seize because it's right to the Kaliningrad border, seized by Spetsnaz or something, and then they have 90 kilometers of the space of the Nemunas Valley without any bridge. And actually, I checked myself, maybe there will be only one additional place where you can make a pontoon bridge, which creates a bastion, a fortress. If Polish forces were to reinforce the Baltic states and came with help, we would need to really knock to the fortress, okay, to get into this battle space.
It is a long distance from Poland up to this red line, if you're not going to go through Kaliningrad Oblast, which I imagine would be politically almost impossible at the start of a conflict. In terms of finding where Poland can maximally break this plan, honestly, I think you would need to have some forces already inside of Lithuania or Eastern Latvia, because it's not an insignificant distance from the Polish-Lithuanian border up to Banevičius. And in particular, the area south of the Nemunas River is fairly navigable. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a whole bunch of small Russian attacks to convince NATO that this is where the real fight is going to be, and then get them to entirely commit to the Suwałki Gap, when actually this is just a minor sideshow. The Polish army does have the tank battalion in Latvia, which is in just north of Riga. But the Latvians are going to be in the midst of putting together their defensive for Riga. They're not going to release forces from the area.
And if I may also add, actually it's a reinforced company, okay, which is much bigger than a company, but still not a full-fledged battalion. And I talked to the officers of this contingent. So this is a very peculiar area in Adazi, to the north and east of Riga, in the very lake terrain, close to the shores, and with multiple axes of potential Russian advance from the east north, and also from the seashore, if there is an amphibious landing in multiple places where it could be launched. And the forces are scarce. Okay, so they can be easily extended. It's not a perfect tank terrain, so to speak. The tanks that we have is PT-91, which is much lighter than Leo 2 or even more Abrams, which is still a good fit for the terrain, but it's a very complex terrain if you really want to fight modern warfare. And Riga is easily to be surrounded by the Russians if there is no forward presence east of Riga of the considerable NATO forces. That would be in defensive positions, and they are lacking, so to speak, at the moment.
I would also emphasize that if you try to defend Riga from the east, you don't need a large number of forces. So the Soviet liberation of Riga in 1944 is not very well remembered among Russian or Soviet historians, simply because Stalin was famously impatient about trying to get there. And so he was trying to shove himself down what today is the A2 highway that goes between Riga and Pskov. And they just could not advance because the terrain is very difficult, even though the Germans are very highly outnumbered. They finally take Riga only after a second Soviet force is able to advance from the south and complete the encirclement of the area. And at that point, the Germans retreat into the Courland pocket. When you could ride a bus to Riga and see just how south of Riga things are relatively open. It's very, very good farmland, rolling terrain, a small patch of area that's perfect for tank warfare. And that's how the Soviets finally advanced on Riga, that succeeded. But there are some new Russian historians who say we should not be thinking so much about the A2 highway because of just how badly this was mismanaged. Again, because Stalin was forcing them to move ahead of their logistical capabilities, but the Russians do love an encirclement, and they love to go along two multiple axes. I would emphasize here, though, just because I've drawn this big line here, and Jacek and I can agree that this is probably the main axis for how they would succeed at this operation, does not mean this is the only place where there would be fighting during this. In fact, because the defense capabilities of these three countries are quite small, mostly because of demographic limitations. I think it's quite possible that the Russians would attempt something small but distracting elsewhere in the countries in order to precipitate some sort of political solution that says, if you just give us this, we will stop causing problems. Or even just dragging the limited resources in the countries away from the main axis going through Brezhnev, Daugavpils, and Panovichy. And when you start getting into that, there's an almost unlimited set of areas that the Russians could strike at that would be relatively small and distracting. But so long as, if it's just, it would accomplish its point so long as it keeps that main axis open. So we shouldn't, just because I've drawn this one arrow doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about the rest of the three countries, but we do need to think about how do we disrupt that main axis to make sure that they don't think they can succeed. That is where I would leave off on the Russian angle. I think I'd like to switch now to looking more specifically at the Polish and US angle today. And to do that, we do have a small problem understanding what the capabilities of the Suwałki Gap are actually going to be in terms of logistical resupply. Instead of thinking about the Russians taking it, I think it's much more useful to think about it as there's only two roads there of any significance, that if you close them, you would no longer be able to move additional resources into the three countries to the north. The defense capabilities that are currently being deployed by NATO into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, I think are the perfect balance for demonstrating that NATO is taking this seriously. I don't necessarily think that they are in the correct place, except in Estonia. Tapa is the perfect place in Estonia. You'll see on the rail map that Tapa is the intersection of the two rail lines east of Tallinn. So there I think they've picked correctly. In Latvia, Adaže just happens to be the big base. The Latvians are working on restoring a couple of the old Soviet bases that they previously had. So over time, this should be resolved. But in the short term, Adaže really is not ideal for a variety of reasons. It's on the wrong side of Riga for everything. And Lithuania, Adaže, the main military rear, is centrally located. It does offer various options for counterattacking against what's coming into the country. But again, I think the core pressure here is going to be that the Russians were going to look like they're coming at Vilnius or Vilno right at the beginning. Not that they actually would, but that if they make even the slightest move to appear that they're coming at it, then it becomes one of those politically impossible to ignore situations. You must do something to defend the capital. Now, the territory around around Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania is not especially navigable simply because of this retreating glacier. But there is one strange exception that we do need to spend more time in NATO exploring, and that is the area southeast of Vilnius going toward the Belarusian border. There's about two major roads there. You see it's got two highways there. The one with the dashed line is the larger highway. It's part of the Polish-speaking section of Lithuania. I know in Lithuanian, the main town on the border is called Medininkai. And it has an old castle. I don't think it was actually in any particular battles. But this is the main highway through which many advances into the Smolensk Gate start. So at the start of the War of 1812, Napoleon used the political Maskirovka to capture Kaunas, or what's today a Kaunas suburb, immediately to make his main crossing over the Nemonis, and immediately advanced to Vilnius, where he was based for a short time, and then uses that particular pass to get over the hills and into Belarus and onto the Smolensk Gate. And from there, it's Smolensk to Moscow. This region is the unique along the entire Lithuanian. There's sort of a higher ground, a higher ridge on the eastern side of Lithuania that it is uniquely open. There's far fewer trees in that area for whatever reason. And it's simply going to be a highway in the event of this becoming a major conflict again, or at least again appearing as such. So understanding what are the ways to defend that particular stretch of terrain, in my opinion, are significantly more useful than studying the Suwałki corridor. As the thing about the Suwałki corridor is, while there will be all sorts of efforts to try to cut it off, the major focus that we in NATO should be thinking about is not so much how to defend it as much as how to repair it, how to keep it moving. Whether that's expanding the road network that's currently there or otherwise, that's going to be the major focus. We also need to think about this in terms of Kaliningrad Oblast's own defense capabilities. Now, Kaliningrad Oblast is not an offensive base. All the units that are there, I think only the naval infantry would possibly be trying to attack out of Kaliningrad. They do have Iskander missiles, which would be used outside of the territory. They have a whole bunch of coastal defense missiles, but I don't think that any of the maneuver units are actually there in order to attack out. They simply don't have enough forces to defeat anybody. If they were to try to attack Lithuania even, I'm not sure that they would be able to overpower Lithuania by themselves. And if they did, then it would be very easy for the Polish division on the border to march back in behind them and take over the exclave. So we shouldn't be thinking about it as an extra offensive basis, but we should also not be thinking that under the scenario, the Russian military is probably going to be a bit occupied with protesters in Kaliningrad. There are more than enough interior, what used to be interior troops, now the Rosgvardia, the Russian National Guard, that will be able to deal with whatever unrest is happening inside of Kaliningrad. So the Russian armed forces are going to be free to do maneuverable defense, as I like to call it in Russian, inside of the terrain around the major cities. And Kaliningrad itself is, I think, about 500,000 people. It's not an especially big city. There's a couple of other medium-sized towns further east that they would be centering on. The central river of the oblast is the Prigolya. It is not a major barrier, but it will be a tactical barrier with a couple of bridges that will need to be either taken or repaired if there was a NATO conventional attack into Kaliningrad. Either way, I think we should be thinking about it's one motor rifle regiment and one motor rifle brigade plus a naval infantry brigade are the only maneuver units inside of Kaliningrad. And these will be taxed to the extreme in trying to defend the territory itself. But I think that they have worked out sufficient plans for doing this sort of maneuverable defense that they should be able to hold out for at least about a week, I would say, before an offensive against Kaliningrad would be able to be successful. However, you don't need...
So, Nicholas, if I may ask you a question. So, do you read from the Russian posture in Kaliningrad that actually they are expecting to be attacked and they feel their vulnerability? So when they look at the map, they see that actually there is no other option as to simply take out the Kaliningrad in order to have the Baltic states. Do you see that? Do you read this posture as such?
Within the Russian literature?
Yes.
I have not seen anybody in Russia say that Kaliningrad needs to be attacked in order to help Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I or at least not me personally, I do suspect that the general staff thinks that because of the trends of exercises that they do in Kaliningrad that is specifically designed to slow down enemy offensives. Then they do it in two stages, whereas in most of Russia, they will do the standard defensive tactical exercise where they're usually the story is that a force of a larger size than the Russian unit is coming at you, and you have to find various ways to move your units around to both first trap them and then stop the offensive. In Kaliningrad, they do it in two stages. There's first the maneuverable defense, which is similar, but they don't usually use the terms of there being an overwhelming force coming against them. And then that is followed up with what I call the search and destroy tactics. They change around the wording somewhat, but the idea is that you're blocking you sufficiently absorb the enemy's forces that you can block their subsequent motions and then eliminate them, which is not typically referred to in the standard Russian defensive tactical exercises. They used to do a lot more of these until 2017. I don't know why it's really dropped off since then of doing these search and destroy type things. But there's basically two stages to it as opposed to the one standard stage that they do elsewhere. Like in the Far East, for example, they love to do the defensive switching to counteroffensive. And this is a very standard old Soviet tactic. So like as the Eastern Military District is planning for war with China. So it's...
again, Nick, if I may, sorry for interrupting. Yes. I asked this question, of course, on purpose. As when we were examining the terrain, it became quite clear to our team that when we are entering Lithuania from Poland, through the Suwałki corridor, then up to the Nemunas River, up to this bridge near Burgas and in Kaunas, there is a vast plain with the main highway leading to Kaunas. And imagine our logistical line and our bulk of troops moving to Kaunas to cross Nemunas just to get to Riga, to get to Poniewice, just to cut the Russian operation through. Our left flank will be entirely exposed from the Kaliningrad. Not only the fire maneuver, which is obvious, but also in case we are attacked, because it's a flat terrain, they will have thousands of approaches to harass or make a big thrust to cut our strategic line of operation through. And for about 70 kilometers, there is no barrier that can impede their maneuvering, okay, which is highly vulnerable, which means that in a model, in an optimal situation, we would like to expand the buffer, to create the buffer, security buffer, extending well into the Kaliningrad Oblast, right behind the Gushev line. Because otherwise, it's almost undeliverable to help Kaunas and the Baltic states far in the north. By the way, the same situation is in the east with the communication hub in Grodno, but that's in Belarus, but this is a different thing. But here, exposure from the left will create the crisis of cohesion of NATO planning while in the war, in the crisis, okay? What to do about this Kaliningrad thing? This will be a very alarming situation, creating vulnerability and on operational side, but if it's not addressed, vulnerability on the cohesion side of NATO, political cohesion.
So on balance, I agree with you, and especially from a Poland-only perspective, that is absolutely true. I think that this would be a better approach to expand the conflict towards Kaliningrad Oblast and cover up, as you say, the extreme vulnerability that Polish forces would be under if they're advancing through Mariampol County towards the Nemunas River. Because, yes, that area is extremely open. Anything could happen. And even if the Russian maneuver units inside of Kaliningrad are being pinned down, the Russian attack helicopters in Kaliningrad will be more than capable of delivering whatever strikes they want. The Iskanders are probably going to be targeting as many things as possible, including just taking out whatever forces are easily accessible inside of Lithuania. So there's no shortage of things that the Russians could do to completely disrupt a Polish advance towards the north of Lithuania. Within NATO planning, I think that there is an over-reliance at the moment, but it is still the reliance that's going through everyone's thoughts, that somehow there's going to be the ability to use Tomahawks from the North Sea to neutralize everything going on in Kaliningrad before you start the advance across the Suwałki corridor, and that will somehow solve the whole problem. I don't have much confidence that this will actually succeed, because even if you do manage to suppress all of the air defense capabilities and all of the missiles and so forth, you still will have those maneuver units basically functional. And at that point, you do need to follow up with something. Now, even without suppressing the missiles, I think that the Polish division, it's the 16th Mechanized Division, isn't it? Or whichever, the division that's in the northeast section of Poland, provided it has air cover, not even necessarily US air cover, maybe even just German and British support, would be able to overwhelm all of the defense capabilities of Kaliningrad Oblast under the condition that it cannot be reinforced by sea. Again, we're assuming throughout all of this that the Baltic Sea is going to be a no-go zone. And it does deserve at least 2 minutes of me saying, the mine as a weapon of war was invented for the Baltic Sea. Every year, NATO does mine countermeasures exercise in the Baltic Sea. They don't need to put out training mines because they find more mines from World War II and World War I to disable. So it's a big exercise that actually has a humanitarian purpose. The Russians do the same thing in the Gulf of Finland. It's even if you don't have missiles, it's extremely easy to close the Baltic Sea. And everyone, I'll just say, I won't qualify for that. Everyone on the coast practices how to close it with mines. So the Baltic Sea is not going to be a major reinforcement avenue, pretty much 6th hour of the war onward. So if we think about it, you have to go overland out of Poland into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Kaliningrad Oblast. I agree with you that it's going to be considerably easier to accomplish the operational end by actually going through most, not all, of Kaliningrad Oblast. In particular, if you can isolate the city of Kaliningrad from the remainder of the oblast, and therefore keep one of the 2 Russian maneuver units stuck in the city, prepared to defend but not necessarily actively defending, then it's not going to take more than 2 Polish brigades to keep them enclosed, and then you start to really open up the territory around it, the territory to the east that you can do reinforcement to defeat whatever Russian attack is currently ongoing inside of Lithuania. You will need to bring up plenty of short-range air defense, but this is a shortcoming that NATO and especially Poland is working on fixing right now. So this is not going to be a huge problem in the medium term. But yes, when the war games that I have done of this also, it's incredibly easier to reinforce the Baltic, reinforce Lithuania and Latvia against a Russian attack if you manage to go through Kaliningrad itself, as opposed to trying to move through the extremely easy to attack area inside of Lithuania. So, yes, I agree with you. I just think that if you try to propose that politically to any government inside of the European Union, this is extremely problematic, because this will, if only because the Russians can portray this somewhat accurately as a major escalation of the conflict. Obviously, we can point to the fact that they are attacking other countries as a major escalation point of the conflict. But part of the whole secret of how Russian disinformation works is that by only going in if Kaliningrad is already in a state of disorder, they can claim that they are actually being a stabilizing force and that most likely the Lithuanians and the Poles would be the ones that would be politically blocking the rail links ahead of a conflict.
Very well, Nicholas, and that means that if we follow the Clausewitz prescription about the military application as a sort of a political tool to achieve the political objectives, then the Russians achieve two objectives at one time. Actually winning the war in line with the theory of war. First is that they remove the vulnerability of the Kaliningrad Oblast by connecting it via the railroad. And the second thing is, by doing so and by inviting the Polish response, or at least thinking about the Polish response, they undermine cohesion of the NATO, which is their goal, actually.
Yes. If they're going for that kind of response, however, then they are going to need to be prepared to fight Poland. And that is going to involve moving a massive quantity of forces into Belarus in order to ensure that no matter what the Poles do, there is an option to attack the rest of the country. So as long as we are assuming that, we should also assume that Polish division on the Kaliningrad border is probably the only unit that Poland will have to spare. And though I suspect it, again, with proper air support, could in fact take Kaliningrad, plus even do some further reinforcement, perhaps not terribly much, but some. The remainder of the Polish army is going to be engaged in an enormous battle going on elsewhere in Poland, most likely the east and southeast, as you've been recently exploring, if this is going to be a full-scale Clausewitzian struggle. I do not know to what extent the Russian General Staff will be thinking about this hypothetical hypothetical plan, simply through the measures of trying to keep this as a full de-escalation scenario, of we are attacking it, but we want this over fast, and we don't want this to turn into World War III, or they would be thinking about it from the outset of, we are going to have maximum insurance policies at all places. If Poland is coming into this environment with a strategic message that under any circumstances, a Russian movement through Latvia, Lithuania is going to require us to counterattack into there, and this convinces the Russians that we need to mount a Clausewitzian counter strategy, then I think under all circumstances, the General Staff is going to assume that they cannot do the de-escalation model. Now, I think from a NATO cohesion standpoint, we need to move towards being ready to defeat the Clausewitzian as opposed to the de-escalation scenario, simply because if we are starting to allow these exceptions of the Russians can take things by force if it just sticks to a rail line, then we are really rewriting the rules of international law pretty dramatically. And as you've said in the past, what we currently have right now is a maritime order, which is built around laws. In land-based orders, the rules are much more sticky. Things change according to what needs to happen.
Along the sinews of power, yes, that's true.
Yes.
Nicholas, I already know that we'll not be able to conclude in this episode, I wanted to ask you a few questions about the perfect Baltic defense scenario and the perfect Baltic defense posture that would need to be in place in order to make sure that the stability and deterrence is in place and nothing happens, of course, in accordance with your idea. But I think we will need to do it in another episode. So maybe let's have some conclusions, okay, on that what we just discussed. So railways as main operational lines of advance for Russians, Kaliningrad Oblast as a sort of a strategic pain, what to do, that cuts through the NATO cohesion, that cuts through the at least upsets the escalation control system. And it has to be simulated politically as well, not only militarily, but politically. So political behavior should be also tested in simulations, how they behave if the escalation is going up. The crucial role of Poland and the United States and the Baltic Sea as a no-go zone. There will be no maritime lines of communication supporting the Baltic countries.
There's one takeaway I want people to have of this. It is to remember that glacier map. The Russian Western Military District, which is in wartime would be the Russian Western High Command, Zapadny Glavny Komandovanie, has 3 strategic directions facing Europe, and the northwest, west, and southwest. The border between the northwest and the west is that glacier line, because they understand that the terrain is markedly different north and south of that line. So south of that, it's going to be a big World War II, southwest especially, it's going to be a big World War II style tank battle capable thing, but obviously with plenty of psychological components in the sense of new generation warfare. North of that, this sort of classical way of thinking about war in Europe is impossible. And if we're going to look at lessons for this from the Soviet era, we need to think about the planning for the defense of Denmark and Norway and not be looking at the Fulda Gap as a historical lesson.
Very interesting. Okay, so for now, let's end. For the audience, I need to assure that I will do my best to convince Nicholas to record another episode with maps, so that we could expand this conversation. So for the time being, thank you very much, Nicholas. Nicholas Myers was our guest at Strategy and Future.
Thank you, Jacek. Always happy to talk.
Thanks, everybody.